Within the folds of modern science appears perhaps the greatest untold story of our generation. It is the simple but seismic truth that the psyche is capable of gleaning information beyond the five senses and all known technology. In plainest terms, this capacity is called extrasensory perception, or ESP. Decades of replicated and bulletproof findings validate this rejected fact of human nature. We are beings both material and immaterial, physically limited and elevated by laws and forces we've only begun to codify. Join me, Mitch Horowitz, as I explore the history, struggles, and proofs of parapsychology, uncovering the extraordinary evidence that ESP is real. Episode 5, Reincarnation, Randomness, and Retrocausality. Despite funding cuts, media evisceration, and the onslaught of skeptics and their muddying of data, parapsychology rises from the ashes. Into the 21st century, academic parapsychologists, sometimes working in isolation, make remarkable strides, even in areas that surpass traditional psi research. Serious studies of life after death, extra-physical survival, and reincarnation re-enter the fold, sometimes with impeccable evidence and methodology. The driving figure behind that movement, Canadian-American psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, in 1967, opens a parapsychology lab at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Stevenson's lab work amasses thousands of cases of physical evidence for reincarnation. Even skeptics are stymied as juried mainstream journals fet his evidence. In terms of intellect, manner, ethics, and gravitas, Stevenson bears similarity to J.B. Rhine. Working for 5 decades from his Division of Perceptual Studies at the UVA Medical School, the researcher traveled 6 continents, accumulating more than 2,500 cases of young children who recounted details of previous lives, which he meticulously verified with witnesses, hospital records, autopsy reports, death certificates, and photographs, eulogized the Journal of Near-Death Studies after his passing in 2007. Stevenson's research group remains active at UVA. It is a clinical psychology lab that studies potential cases of reincarnation and after-death survival based on physical evidence, forensic records, on-site visits, historical data, and psychological exams. Stevenson himself personally reviewed thousands of cases where people claimed past life memories. He documented episodes in countries and households around the world where children described past life experiences, sometimes through dreams or overt memories, and in some cases, the subjects bore birthmarks, blemishes, or birth defects that correlated to the circumstances of someone who had died at times nearby prior to the birth of the child and who was unknown to the child and family. For example, this may have included someone dying of a bullet wound to the abdomen and a child reporting past life memories having a correlating abdominal birthmark or deformity. A plurality of Stevenson's suggestive cases, between 30 and 80%, depending on nation, featured a violent death. He also found a notable number of cases where people who identified as a different gender than that assigned at birth suggested a gender difference in a past life context. Stevenson's case studies were highly detailed in their forensics. In his 1997 book, Reincarnation and Biology, he collected 200 case studies that suggested the possibility of authentic past life experiences. For example, a number of the children he studied had birthmarks or birth defects that matched wounds, often fatal wounds, on the body of an alleged previous personality. 18 of those cases included children born with double birthmarks, which corresponded to both the entrance wound and the exit wound on the bodies of gunshot victims. Stevenson also documented cases of xenoglossy, in which an individual speaks in a language that he or she has never learned or been widely exposed to. For example, he studied an American Methodist minister's wife who, under hypnosis, would appear to lapse into the personality of a German-speaking girl and speak fluent German. Stevenson thought she was either experiencing a past life, which she had identified herself, or she was encountering a possible case of spirit possession. A more persuasive case was that of an Indian woman who was bilingual in this life, speaking English and a Hindi dialect, but also spoke Bengali under hypnosis, which she had not been exposed to or had any obvious knowledge of. The woman recalled a wealth of detailed information, including Bengali family names about a supposed past life, which Stevenson substantiated and matched to a family the woman said she had previously belonged to. In one of Stevenson's most remarkable cases, he explored the circumstances around a Lebanese woman named Sada, who had traveled to Richmond, Virginia for cardiac surgery and died there. 10 days later, a baby, Suzanne, was born to a Lebanese family residing in Richmond, Virginia. At age 5, Suzanne told her parents she was Sada and wanted to be reunited with her children and husband. At the age of 16 months, when neither Lebanese family had known of each other, Suzanne pulled the household phone off the hook and said her first words, "Hello, Leela." When Suzanne's parents sought out Sada's family, they discovered that Sada had tried to phone her daughter Leela from the hospital in Richmond, but died before getting through. The 5-year-old also astonished her alleged previous family when she asked the person she believed was her daughter, a grown woman, "Did your uncle give you your jewels? Did he give Layla hers?" Just before her death and before Suzanne was born, Sada asked her brother to divide her jewelry between her daughters.
This case illustrates not only the statements that these children make, but the behavior, the unusual behavior, the involvement with the other family. And that's a point that I will be emphasizing repeatedly during my remarks. It's part of a lesson for myself, because when I first began studying these cases, I thought they would consist only of statements that the child made, and all you had to do was verify those and make sure the child couldn't have learned about the other person normally. But there is much more to the cases than that, as I subsequently discovered.
I want to say a final word of tribute to Stevenson. In a 2002 profile of the researcher in a UVA magazine, he was asked how he became interested in reincarnation. He responded, "My beliefs should make no difference to anyone. In our age of morbid disclosures, it is refreshing to find a scholar who insists that his personal beliefs and background are of little importance. What matters is the fineness and excellence of his work. Also like Rein, Stevenson proved rigorous at establishing protocols. In November 2013, skeptic Jesse Bering wrote of Stevenson's body of data in Scientific American. I'd be happy to say it's all complete and utter nonsense, a moldering cesspool of irredeemable anti-scientific drivel. The trouble is, it's not entirely apparent to me that it is. I'm not quite ready to say that I've changed my mind about the afterlife, but I can say that a fair assessment and a careful reading of Stevenson's work has, rather miraculously, managed to pry it open. Well, a tad anyway. In September 1977, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, a peer-reviewed mainstream medical journal, dedicated a full issue to Stevenson's work, as did the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2008. Motivated listeners can explore Stevenson's 1997 magnum opus, Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects, a work of 2,268 pages. I also recommend Stevenson's first book on the topic from 1966, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, and the extant efforts of his colleague Jim B. Tucker, MD, at UVA's medical school. One of the key questions surrounding parapsychology is application. What is it good for? One would like to believe that pure questioning, especially at the university level, is justification in itself. The injunction to know thyself seems basely unfulfilled if humanity is estranged from its extra-physical nature, knowledge of which, as explored in our final episode, may actually serve to increase occurrence and trackability of non-local phenomena. But still, it must be acknowledged that a great deal of what occurs in scientific research, including in academia, is geared toward monetization, itself not exclusive from advancement. In that vein, one of the most fertile areas of potential application is studying how the PK effect, codified by J.B. and Louisa Rein, might impact digital networks, including those used in national defense. Starting around 1979, researchers at Princeton University began this practical inquiry and succeeded in raising extraordinary questions about the existence of a global, universal consciousness. Their vehicle was one of the most successful, intrepid, and, for a time, well-funded parapsychology labs in the U.S., Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, or PAIR, founded in 1979 and shuttered in 2007 after its founder's retirement. Although researchers at the university and affiliates elsewhere have continued its work under the rubric of the Global Consciousness Project. Experimental psychologist Roger D. Nelson writes, "The PAIR Lab was founded in 1979 by Robert K. Jan, then Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Princeton University. Jan was a physicist and a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and also headed a NASA-funded program researching electric propulsion systems for spacecraft. He was asked by an undergraduate to sponsor an independent study to try to replicate findings by Helmut Schmidt that suggested that the behavior of sensitive equipment based on a physical random source could be influenced by human intention. The results of this study persuaded Jan that the questions deserved a serious examination. He sought funding from private donors and began building a staff and laboratory space. Due to Pear's efforts, we possess evidence of dramatic or otherwise notable events such as the terrorist attacks of 9/11, producing statistical deviations in expected random outputs in machinery called random number generators, or sometimes random event generators. Random number generators emit infinite streams of chaotic numbers without pattern or order. This technology is often used to devise online passwords. Scientists at Pear documented periods of worldwide emotional intensity. Other examples include the first elections of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, during which random number generators in select locations around the world demonstrated inexplicable patterns or interruptions in randomness during episodes of mass human attention and emotion. Periods of collective attention or emotion in widely distributed populations will correlate with deviations from expectation in a global network of physical random number generators, researchers wrote in their test hypothesis. Patterns, sometimes slight, other times more pronounced, appear where none should. There ought to be perfect chaos. The data suggests, at least as a proposition, that we as a human species produce some manner of psychokinetic signal or disruptive awareness during episodes of mass emotional intensity.
What happens at the edges of what we know about with consciousness? Is there any real presence of consciousness in the physical world? So we set up experiments to ask that question and got an answer, which was yes. Not a big surprise to people who are interested in spiritual matters, but a terribly difficult thing for most mainstream scientists to accept or themselves take any time really to examine.
Stay tuned in for even more extraordinary evidence after the break. Most professional skeptics deal in sound bites. I have an open mind, but that doesn't mean I have a hole in my head, was one of James Randi's favorites. Hence, when parapsychologists walk in the footsteps of other social researchers, such as behavioralists, zoologists, ethologists, and clinical psychologists, studying what is colloquially called animal instinct, the opportunity for guffaws abounds. This touches upon the experience of Cambridge biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Sheldrake was named one of the top 100 global thought leaders of 2013 by Switzerland's prestigious Duttweiler Institute. Yet today on Wikipedia, he is called a purveyor of pseudo-science for his theories of biological resonance and psi. He has, in just one leg of his career, performed years-long studies of animal instinct, including of dogs who appear hyper-aware of when their owners are headed home. Some of his key results appear in A Dog That Seems to Know When His Owner is Coming Home, Videotaped Experiments and Observations by Rupert Sheldrake and Pamela Smart in the January 2000 Journal of Scientific Exploration. A great many dog owners notice that their pets seem to have a preternatural instinct for when an owner is preparing to take them for a walk or give them food or, in fact, when a member of the household is coming home. Even if these things occur randomly without any cues and fall at a time of day that's outside of the animal's routine. we refer to this as instinct and we leave it at that. But what is instinct really? The biologist and parapsychologist Rupert Sheldrake decided to peel back the onion a further layer, as scientists are supposed to do, and elected to study animal behavior so that we could get a sharper image of what it is that we really mean when we all commonly use the word instinct. Sheldrake has posited the possibility of morphic fields where all animals, human beings included, communicate at a cellular level, again, which we might term telepathy. And he studied the case in the mid-1990s of a dog in England whose owner had reported a unique constancy of activity where the dog would remain by the window for an extended period of time when its owner was coming home from work or an errand or wherever she may have been. In short, Sheldrake set up a video camera running 100 trials of the dog appearing by the window and lingering by the window for extended times when its owner was preparing to return home from some unknown location, violating common schedules, and not even embarking on her trip back home, but in fact just thinking about, preparing to commence her return journey. He eliminated every possibility of the dog having retained memory from routine schedules, of the dog hearing the sound of a familiar automobile, of the dog picking up on any domestic or routine cues that might direct it that the owner was on her way home. In fact, the way that Sheldrake devised the experiment was really painstaking. Sometimes they switched homes where the dog might be staying at the household of the owner's extended family. Sometimes they had the owner return home in her own car, sometimes in a taxi, sometimes in somebody else's car. They varied time intervals, they varied distance. The only constancy was that without there being any cue in terms of memory, routine, sound, or any other domestic behavior that would tip off the dog, so to speak, the owner returned home at a variety of different times from a variety of different places in a variety of different ways. And in short, Sheldrake found that at such times, excluding the possibility of any other clues or tip-offs, her dog was waiting by the window for an extended stretch, about 78% of the time, until she walked in the door. He mapped out this information painstakingly and with great care. His method of mapping out the data was as meticulous as the structure of the experiment itself. To bottom line it, the data shows that the owner's dog demonstrated an extraordinary instinct, something that in humans we would call telepathy, and that in animals we call animal instinct or what have you, for knowing when its owner was embarking on her home journey without there being any cues, schedules, routines involved, and in fact with a dramatic variation of routine, vehicle, time lapse. Regardless, the dog spent a statistical 78% of the time for an extended stretch by the main window of the household with the obvious expectancy that the owner was embarking on her way home, not infrequently from many miles away. There could be no issue of noise or anything of that nature. There was nothing polluted in the experiments, and they demonstrated that animal instinct, a term that we use every day, and even though pseudo-skeptics poke fun at parapsychologists for studying ESP and dogs as if it's something so eccentric and strange. In fact, zoologists and ethologists study animal behavior all the time, ranging from pigeons to fish, fowl, you name it. And The point of science is to challenge our colloquialisms. We all use the term instinct, and we all use it in reference to animals. None of us have the slightest idea what we're talking about. Sheldrake at least hoped to map out that there is actually something going on there. You call it telepathy, call it a morphic field, or just laugh it off, as most pseudo-skeptics will do. But the fact is, zoological experiments of this type help clue us in not only to animal behavior, but to animal sensory perception, which begs questions about our own such perception. Sheldrake's efforts to parse matters of instinct, a widely recognized, if colloquially defined, phenomenon, encountered inquisitorial and questionable pushback. English skeptic Richard Wiseman and a team of collaborators quickly reran Sheldrake's instinct experiments and deemed them a failure in popular media. Sheldrake countered with detail and aplomb that in fact the skeptics had gotten very similar numbers to his own, but mapped them differently, a fact over which Wiseman and colleagues spun endless retorts but never addressed or, in my view, justified. The pushback generated at least 5 detailed scholarly or scholarly-style articles. I consider this brinksmanship an intentional device, often restating questioned or rebutted premises to the point where original findings are muddied and a plethora of counterclaims gain media dominance. A deadline reporter or student looks up the matter and presto, Wiseman is also a stage magician, the counterclaims seem to tell the whole story. Some parapsychologists and sympathetic partisans have argued that I spend too much time parsing lab work, that better, more dramatic, and equally provable episodes appear in the field of life. As historian of religions Jeffrey J. Kripal, my own Professor X, wrote me in early 2022, the notion that passion is critical is embedded in the coinage of the term telepathy, or pathos at a distance, and not indifferent neutrality at a distance. F.W.H. Myers, in fact, linked telepathy to eros. Others, including the late parapsychologist Lawrence Lashan, have told me that lab work, while once valuable, is now exhausted. The basic trackable facts are established. We require a new model to carry the work forward. I was on the fence until Cornell University research psychologist Daryl J. Bem published a 2011 paper on his decade-long experiments into precognition and retrocausality. Bem's data, impeccable, transparent, replicated, and since found confirmatory in a large meta-analysis, opened new vistas in practical, laboratory-based ESP research. Called Feeling the Future, Bem's study ran in the highly regarded Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. In the psychologist's most widely discussed finding, he provided statistical evidence for retrocausality in cognition, specifically determining that future study improves present performance. The response was swift and withering. Critics in academia and news media called Bem's work an embarrassment. Skeptics reran his trials and said they failed. One journalist argued that the clinicians' results themselves prove science is broken. A decade on, however, the unthinkable has occurred. Bem's data has stood up. For about 10 years, the psychologists conducted a series of 9 experiments involving more than 1,000 participants into precognition, or time reversing, of widely established cognitive or psychological effects, such as memorization of a list or responding to negative or erotic stimuli flashed as images on a screen. Bem's data suggest the reach of cognition across boundaries of linear time. Bem, as with other researchers, including Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, identified factors that seem to correlate with precognition, including the body's response to arousing or disturbing imagery. Bem wrote of previous experiments in presentiment of stimuli. Most of the pictures were emotionally neutral, but a highly arousing negative or erotic image was displayed on randomly selected trials. As expected, strong emotional arousal occurred when these images appeared on the screen, but the remarkable finding is that the increased arousal was observed to occur a few seconds before the picture appeared, before the computer had even selected the picture to be displayed. In one of Bem's trials, subjects were asked to guess at erotic images alternated with benign images. Across 100 sessions, he wrote, participants correctly identified the future position of the erotic pictures significantly more frequently than the 50% hit rate expected by chance, 53.1%. In contrast, their hit rate on the non-erotic pictures did not differ significantly from chance, 49.8%. This was true across all types of non-erotic pictures. Neutral pictures, 49.6%. Negative pictures, 51.3%. Positive pictures, 49.4%. And romantic but non-erotic pictures, 50.2%. The response to either arousing or disturbing imagery is suggestive of the emotional stakes required for the presence of a psi effect, to which J.B. Rhine alluded in the appendix to a British edition of his 1934 monograph, Extrasensory Perception. Since my greatest interest is in stimulating others to repeat some of these experiments, I should like to mention here what has seemed to me to be the most important condition for ESP. This is a spontaneity of interest in doing it. The fresh interest in the act itself, like that of a child in playing a new game, seems to me the most favorable circumstance. Add now the freedom from distraction, the absence of disturbing skepticism, the feeling of confidence, or at least of some hope, and I think many good subjects can be found in any community or circle. In his 1937 New Frontiers of the Mind, Rhine further emphasized the role of spontaneity, confidence, comity, novelty, curiosity, and lack of fatigue, and, as it happens, caffeine. Bem's horizons extended even further. In the most innovative element of his 9-part study, the researchers set out to discover in experiments 8 and 9 whether subjects displayed improved recall of lists of words that were to be practice memorized in the future.
And the fourth is precognition or premonition. The word premonition means warning, which is cognitive or affective anticipation of future events. In prior presentations of this, I've used the words retroactive influence or retroactive causality, and that too suggests a commitment to a mechanism. And given that physicists are now debating whether we even need the notion of causality in our descriptions, so I've changed it to just the anticipation of future events, trying to be just more descriptive. There have been previous precognition experiments. One of the unsettling things that happened, given the publicity I've gotten on these, is people either treat me as a fraud, or the people who like this stuff think I'm Copernicus. You know, I'm the first person ever to do this, and which I think annoys the hell out of my colleagues, and should.
More extraordinary evidence when we return. Inspired by the White Queen's claim, Bem wrote, the current experiment tested the hypothesis that memory can work both ways, by testing whether rehearsing a set of words makes them easier to recall, even if the rehearsal takes place after the recall test is given. Participants were first shown a set of words and given a free recall test of those words. They were then given a set of practice exercises on a randomly selected subset of those words. The psi hypothesis was that the practice exercises would retroactively facilitate the recall of those words, and hence participants would recall more of the to-be-practiced words than the unpracticed words. Bem found a statistically significant improvement of recall on the list of words studied in the near future. The results, he wrote, show that practicing a set of words after the recall test does, in fact, reach back in time to facilitate the recall of those words. In Experiment 9, this retroactive effect increased when researchers added a refined practice exercise. A new practice exercise was introduced immediately following the recall test in an attempt to further enhance the recall of the practiced words. This exercise duplicated the original presentation of each word that participants saw prior to the recall test, but only the practice words were presented. The results improved. This modified replication yielded an even stronger side effect than the original experiment. In general, future memorization heightened current recall. The 2011 paper attracted tremendous controversy. Some critics even suggested that Bem's study was meant as satire or an exposé of foundational flaws in the scientific model of data gathering, although Bem's work in parapsychology goes back many years. Abandoning tones of probity that he displayed in earlier collaborations within parapsychology, University of Oregon psychologist and skeptic Ray Hyman told the New York Times, "It's craziness, pure craziness. I can't believe a major journal is allowing this work in. I think it's just an embarrassment for the entire field." Within a year of Bem's publication, a trio of professional skeptics published a rejoinder. Playing off Bem's Feeling the Future, their paper sported the media-friendly title, Failing the Future. The experimenters reran Bem's 9th experiment. They wrote in their abstract, 9 recently reported parapsychological experiments appear to support the existence of precognition. We describe 3 pre-registered independent attempts to exactly replicate one of these experiments, retroactive facilitation of recall, which examines whether performance on a memory test can be influenced by a post-test exercise. All 3 replication attempts failed to produce significant effects, and thus do not support the existence of psychic ability. I have repeatedly noted the confusion, some of it, I warrant, intentional, that polemical skeptics bring to this material in reference sources and media. This situation is so pronounced that on September 12, 2021, I privately emailed parapsychologist and friend Dean Radin. Would you say that the Bem word memory experiments are too pockmarked by data gathering problems or lack of replicability to be ranked among core literature? In his typically understated manner, Dean replied, "The Bem experiments are fine." This began my personal efforts to sort out what is unclear in dominant media and search rankings. Skeptics cooked the books. In the study that I cited earlier, Failing the Future, the authors omitted a critical detail from their own database. By deadline, they possessed 2 independent studies that replicated Bem's results. They made no mention of the opposing studies despite their own ground rules for doing so. Bem wrote in his response, in their article, co-author Stuart J. Ritchie et al. Mention that their experiments were pre-registered. They are referring to an online registry set up by co-author Richard Wiseman himself, asking anyone planning a replication to pre-register it and then to provide him with the data when the study is completed. As he noted on the registration website, we will carry out a meta-analysis of all registered studies that have been completed by 1 December 2011. By the deadline, 6 studies attempting to replicate the retroactive recall effect had been completed, including the 3 failed replications reported by Ritchie et al. And 2 other replications, both of which successfully reproduced my original findings at statistically significant levels. One of them was conducted in Italy using Italian words as stimuli. Even though both successful studies were pre-registered on Wiseman's registry and their results presumably known to Ritchie et al., they failed to mention them in this article. In the type of gear-grinding reply that renders these debates self-perpetuating, the skeptics referenced other studies that had failed to reproduce Bem's results. At least one of them was an online study that Bem disputed, without addressing his criticism. The authors were scrupulous about this much, thanking Bem for making his database, software, and instructions available gratis to any researchers who wished to retread his efforts, which runs counter to the oft-heard canard that ESP experiments elude repetition or that parapsychologists avoid repeat trials. In an otherwise caustic article written from the a priori assumption that ESP is impossible because it is impossible, journalist Daniel Engberger noted in Slate in 2017, to help get this project underway, Bem had granted researchers full access to his data and provided a detailed how-to guide for redoing his experiments, a level of transparency that was pretty much unheard of at the time. Yet, without considering the plausibility of psi beyond "it couldn't be true," in the words of a counter-researcher, the writer concluded, Bem had shown that even a smart, rigorous scientist could cart himself to crazy land just by following the rules of the road. Science itself is broken, the piece went, with Bem's analysis as Exhibit A. Although there unquestionably exists a significant crisis of replicability and data manipulation, not to mention fraud, in the social and natural sciences, no one has directly tied any of this to Bem or his methods. Contrary to the stated nature of skepticism, however, inference sometimes trumps facts. On August 27, 2015, the New York Times ran an article, "Many Psychology Findings Not as Strong as Claimed," study says, by Benedict Carey. The piece dealt with a series of high-grade failures that rocked the social sciences over the previous several years, including misreports, research retractions, and fabrications. Amid this malfeasance, the opening paragraph read, "A top journal published a study supporting the existence of ESP that was widely criticized." It hyperlinked to Bem's study. Bem's paper was grouped with and cited as a prime exhibit of polluted data. But not once in the article did the reporter further reference Bem's study or support why it was characterized with fraudulent and compromised research. At the time, the paper maintained an editorial ombudsman. I wrote her to call this out. I received no reply. I wrote a letter to the editor. It did not run. I have written for the New York Times myself on controversial topics. A year before the article, I published an op-ed on the global problem of violence against accused witches. In this case, and another pillorying of BEM that followed in 2023, both grouping the researchers' work without an explanation among corrupted data, I could gain no hearing. What about BEM's findings and the crisis of replication? As of July 2020, BEM's experiments, including the original trials, proved confirmatory in a meta-analysis encompassing 90 experiments in 33 laboratories in 14 different nations. Indulge my repetition of that figure. To encourage replications, BEM and his co-authors wrote in the abstract of their follow-up paper, all materials needed to conduct them were made available on request. We here report a meta-analysis of 90 experiments from 33 laboratories in 14 countries, which yielded an overall effect greatly exceeding the standard for decisive evidence in support of the experimental hypothesis. After a January 2022 talk in which I defended BEM's data, I heard from professional skeptic Michael Shermer, who wrote on Twitter, "Dear Mitch Horowitz, Rupert Sheldrake et al. BEM's precognition experiment was not replicated 90 times. 72 studies revealed no effect, 18 were statistically significant. There is as of yet no compelling reason to draw the inference precognition exists." He linked to a critique of the aforementioned meta-analysis. After a degree of inconclusive back and forth, this being Twitter after all, I replied, "Michael, I do not believe you understand meta-analysis. Statistically significant refers to the p-value associated with a study. It does not mean the effect is real or not real. What you want to know is what is the size of the effect under study. If the effect is small, which is the case for practically all experiments in the behavioral and social sciences, then the results of any single study may well not reach statistical significance because not enough trials of the study were run. But if the effect size per study is observed to be about the same over many replications, and the overall estimate of the effect is not zero, then you are dealing with a real phenomenon. That is the purpose of meta-analysis. The BEM meta-analysis shows that the effects are indeed repeatable over many replications, and that the effect is above zero. In fact, from a statistical perspective, we have very high confidence that it is above zero. But even beyond this, one would expect that 5% of studies would be statistically significant at the p equals 0.05% level purely by chance. But that's not what we have here. We see 18 out of 90 studies being significant. That's 20%. Far more than the chance expectation of 5%. You have a naive understanding of how to properly evaluate replication of experimental effects. The 90 studies meta-analyzed show significant effect. I have now, for the third and final time, invited you to a formal, jointly sponsored debate, since Twitter is so limited a forum. I believe that I am highlighting only the glacial tip of how parapsychological data is mishandled within much of mainstream news media and large swaths of academia. After a certain point of tautological criticism of nearly a century of academic ESP research, it becomes difficult to avoid using a strong word that I prefer not to use and that I do not use lightly: suppression. Not of any centrally organized sort, but of a cultural sort, in which prevailing findings run so counter to materialist assumptions that critics, who, ironically, perceive themselves as arbiters of rationality, assume an at-any-cost stance to dispel contrary data. Winning becomes more important than proving. It is the antithesis of science. This is the irony to which 21st century skepticism has brought us. But truth, as seen in Bem's efforts, possesses strange resiliency. Thank you for listening to Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. This series was produced by Jim Perry and John McEdward for Spectre Vision Radio, edited by John McEdward, with original music by Dean Hurley, written and narrated by me, Mitch Horowitz. Join us for our concluding segment, Episode 6, Pink Buckets. Now that key facts and figures are explored, it remains to consider why any of this data exists at all, how psi works, at least in theory, and whether there exists a viable theory, and what matters about any of this.
If one questions it, new forms of research, new possibilities open up. And I think as we question these dogmas that have held back science so long, science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I'm a total believer in the importance of science. I've spent my whole life as a research scientist, my whole career. But I think by moving beyond these dogmas, it can be regenerated. Once again, it can become interesting and, I hope, life-affirming.